When I was about 12 years old, I had the chance to talk to Wayne Gretzky on the phone at his home in LA. It's true. For those of you who do not know, Wayne Gretzky is considered the greatest hockey player of all time. And he dominates most of the records for most of the goals in a season, the most assists, the most points. His nickname is the Great One. And he was hockey royalty in Canada. And so as a kid and as a teenager, I was obsessed with Gretzky. I had all of his hockey cards, including his rookie card. I knew all of his numbers, all of his stats. I read everything I could about him. I even saw him play live. And so I had the chance to talk to my hockey hero on the phone. Now, I wasn't a phone stalker. It was a sports talk radio show in Vancouver, hosted by Tony Gallagher. It was a very brief show. Some of you may remember it. And Wayne Gretzky was the guest. And I called in, and I was the second caller. But I had to get past a screener. You know, a producer, a screener. What are you going to ask him? What's your name? What questions are you going to ask him? And so I had to think of a couple of good questions. So I thought of a couple of good questions, and I was told I'm the second caller and, you know, what I had to do. And, of course, as a kid, I was nervous and excited. I was talking to someone, in my view, that was awesome. Right? To use that word. He was the Great One. But I was nervous, excited, and intimidated. The host of this radio show was a well-known journalist, and his nickname was The Undertaker. He delighted in burying people. And in fact, the Canucks management hated him. They wanted him fired on numerous occasions. He was gruff and combative and sarcastic, and if you said something dumb, you would hear the brunt of his, kind of biting sarcasm. And, but still, I wanted to talk to Gretzky, even if the host might be a jerk. So all of a sudden just as I hear the host's voice, "Go ahead, caller number 2, you're on the line with Wayne Gretzky." I had this little moment. What do I call him? Do I say Wayne? Do I say Mr. Gretzky? Do I say, "Oh, Great One"? Like, what do I say as I'm going to address Wayne Gretzky? And so I kind of stammered and stuttered a bit. Hi, Wayne, Mr. Gretzky. But in between that little brief stammer and stutter, Gallagher says, "Go ahead, caller." Right? Just kind of barks it at me. And I got my question out and were questions, and Gretzky was very gracious and kindly answered them. "Oh, those are good questions," and answered my questions. Now, some of you are wondering, what does this have to do with anything? And that's a great question. This, of course, is a continuation of our series on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And hopefully, this strange opening story will help unite and illuminate a couple aspects of our passage today as we look at this. We're looking at two aspects in the Sermon on the Mount, the part of ask, seek, and knock, and also what is known as Jesus' famous golden rule, the so-called golden rule. And both of those sections could easily be two separate messages, but I'm going to try to perhaps do the impossible and try to look at both together. So we're going to open the scriptures. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, and we're going to read 7 to 12, and I think we should have it on the screen. "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." These verses mark a startling shift in the Sermon on the Mount from the previous section that we saw last week on Judge Not. And the best commentators have been very puzzled and debated how they fit into the larger context, and even the shift between verse 11 and verse 12 with all of a sudden "so" and everything is hard to discern. What is that connection with that so, that therefore? In fact, some translations just drop the word so and therefore because it just doesn't seem to make some sense in English, but it's clearly there in the text. But how, what is that therefore is what people struggle with, and how it fits the larger structure. So this becomes the climax at some level of the body of the sermon. It comes back, we saw earlier, Larry looked at that passage, I came not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them, right? And this becomes the bookend to the body of the sermon, and later as he kind of concludes with his final calls about the two houses and the two ways and the two types of builders as he concludes the sermon. But this seems to conclude it, and we'll look at those two elements of this. But in the midst of this sermon that's calling for this higher inner heart righteousness, Jesus offers what are often seen as the most encouraging words of the sermon. In fact, in his book, a helpful book called The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing, Jonathan Pennington, he says this: by itself, Matthew 7:7-11 is one of the most encouraging and hope-giving sections of the sermon and even of the whole New Testament. What makes it so encouraging? We're told as followers, we're given this very straightforward invitation to seek God, to meet our needs with confidence, based on this invitation to relate to God not as this omnipotent, removed deity, but as a good, good Father. And here, it's surprisingly unqualified and open-ended, leaving us with even more questions. Jesus just rhetorically just puts, ask, seek, knock. What? Ask what? Seek what? Knock and what? What's going to be open? And it's just open, and there's not all these qualifications, and it's startling in its openness. And we're left to reflect on this. Well, what can this mean? And sometimes you hear various messages on the Sermon on the Mount. We feel like we're constantly qualifying. Well, this can't mean this, and hedging and nuancing, and that. But this seems fairly open and straightforward. And there we have this invitation. And many of us here, no doubt, many Christians and others feel very guilty about their lack of an active prayer life. Or they feel as soon as someone starts talking about prayer, like, oh, okay, yeah, I know. And it's easy to make Christians feel guilty about that. But guilt never produces a more active prayer life. Jesus' words in this text provide a different way of motivating his followers. Instead of using guilt, he casts this very compelling vision of the character of God, of the goodness of the Father. In chapter 6, he talked about the pagans, the pagan Gentiles that would, try to placate and manipulate their various gods of the Hellenistic world, and they would pray with many, many words, babbling with many words, and thinking for their numerous words they're going to be heard. And he'd often speak about the religious leaders within Judaism, the scribes and the Pharisees, that would often pray in a very showy, public, performative way, as Jesus says, to be seen, for the praise of others, to be known as these great prayers. And he says, do not be like them. I mean, John Stott sees do not be like them as kind of the theme of the whole sermon at some level, this counterculture that he's putting forward to his disciples. But earlier in chapter 6, and we saw that with Ward looking at the model prayer, the paradigm prayer, the Lord's Prayer, often called sometimes the disciples' prayer because he's teaching them to pray. It offers this foundation of the praying life, a framework for all praying. And it has these petitions and these requests to God. And we saw some of those, the hallowing of God's name, the coming of God's kingdom, the doing of his will, but also give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us. Lead us not. Deliver us. These petitions, these requests. He teaches them how to pray, these interests. And some of these are these very human concerns, like daily bread. But what's interesting in relation to our passage here in chapter 7, in the Lord's Prayer, he starts with our Father. Our Father. And there's this orientation towards God as a father, as a divine parent. Father is one of the key words of the Sermon on the Mount. He uses this word to refer to God over 17 times in these 3 chapters. And it's almost always with your Father, our Father, with like a possessive pronoun in the beginning. But that's a loaded word for many of us in our lives and in our culture, Father. and all this discussion about patriarchy and what this might means, and people's own relationship with a parent, with a father, especially. I was talking to a pastor a few weeks ago, and he grew up with a very strained and estranged relationship with his father. His dad was just explosively angry and bitter and harsh, and he said, I never heard a kind word from him in my entire childhood, my entire teens. He had a terrible relationship with his father growing up. And so if someone like that is singing, Good, Good Father, there has to be a shift of the vision of what a father, what a parent means. And Jesus kind of elaborates in an interesting analogy. He makes it very kind of human and homely of how he presents this to his disciples of this relationship. Because the father he depicts here is not the stern, volatile, explosively arbitrary father who just is distant and removed and sometimes can just explode on them. He's this good, good father, this caring father who provides for his children, who's interested in his children. He gives good gifts to his children. He doesn't give them something useless or harmful or dangerous. And that's what that analogy is about, where he points out from this human parent-child relationship. What if a hungry kid asks his parent for bread? Right? Would any among you, Jesus asked his followers, give him a stone, give him a rock? Right? Something useless or perhaps harmful? You know, you can maybe picture some of you that remember Charlie Brown, the dejected, I got a rock. Right? Going around, everyone's putting all the candies in the trick-or-treat bag, and I got a rock. He's like, would you be given a rock? If the child asked for fish to eat, would the parent give the child a snake? Right? There's some danger. Is he going to play a joke, give the kid this potentially dangerous snake? Luke's gospel has, in the parallel passage, that makes this even more vivid. If the child asks for an egg, will he give him a scorpion? Right? Feared in that region for their sting. Of course not. Of course not. It's rhetorical. It demands the no. Of course not. And he makes this clear. If you, he says, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father give good gifts to those who ask him? It's this argument from the lesser to the greater. Earthly parents, in comparison with God's perfect standard of righteousness, are evil. They're bent. They're broken. Twisted, often with our own selfishness, our own exhaustion, our own misdirected desires. I have 4 children. You know, you can understand that. Yes, okay, right? What that might mean, but you see this element that you still try and strive to give good gifts to your children to meet some of their needs and provisions. And he makes this analogy: if even you know how to do this with all of your own baggage, know how to do this, how much more will your Father give good things to those who ask him? And as we all, hopefully many of us have realized that. Many of us personally received many generous and good gifts. I received many generous gifts from my father when he was alive, and also my mother, and also from my father-in-law and my mother-in-law up there in the balcony. I think my father-in-law might be asleep, but he might be awake. He told me to stay awake, but he's awake. I see the hands, okay. But many good, generous gifts, many unasked for gifts. And also any time my wife and I have asked any of our parents, could you guys help with this? Is it possible to do this? Do this? They drop what they're doing. They make a way. They do that. This is what he says. If you earthly parents know how to do this, with all your own baggage and your own selfishness and your own bent, if you know how to do this, how much more will your Father give good gifts to those who ask them? And Isaiah draws this out, quotes the Lord's words as well. Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child that she has born? And the expected answer is, no, of course not. But perhaps there's a few strange stories of some mother that abandons her child. And the Lord says, even though she might forget you, I will never forget you. There's this paternal heart of God. And if we're tempted to think about God as distant and indifferent, Jesus reminds us that God's parental care and concern for his children is much greater than we can imagine. Right? It's tempting sometimes, I think, for us to kind of imagine some malicious glee, make us squirm, I told you so. This is some of the image, right? But parental kindness in this world is a window into who God is and what God is really like, a God who wants to provide for his children's needs and give good gifts to his children. James tells us every good and perfect gift comes from above, from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. And we're invited here to ask, to make our requests known, to pray and keep praying for things that actually concern us. Right? Many of us find it nearly impossible to pray because we think it might have to be very highly spiritual and lofty, remote needs that we aren't really that interested in or genuinely don't matter to us too much. And here, I want to quote from Dallas Willard. I find him very helpful in discussing this. He says this: the way to get to more meaningful prayer for those good things is to start by praying for what we are truly interested in. The circle of our interests will inevitably grow in the largeness of God's love. What prayer as asking presupposes is simply a personal, that is, an experientially interactive relationship between us and God, just as with a request of a child to a parent. It assumes our natural concerns will be naturally expressed and that God will hear our prayers for ourselves as well as for others. Requests will naturally be made in the course of our conversational walk with God. Prayer is a matter of explicitly sharing with God my concerns about what he's concerned about in my life. And of course, he is concerned about my concerns, and in particular that my concerns should coincide with his. He continues, only a vivid assurance of God's greatness and goodness can lay a foundation for a life of prayer. Prayer is a total activity, incorporating many elements essential to a personal relationship between two persons, different from and related to one another as the Father is to his children on earth. And it's very helpful words. And at the heart of this relationship, of course, is relationship, as Lisa said. And Jesus invites his followers to have confidence in God in this relationship as a good and giving Father. I had my chance to talk to the Great One, ask Wayne Gretzky a couple of questions. But on other occasions, when we were tried to stalk him at the Pacific Coliseum and get autographs and do various things, he wasn't with the other players. He took secret exits. There were barriers and obstacles. There was no access to him. And of course, he didn't truly care about his fans. I mean, that's humanly impossible. How could he? And some fans are crazy. I was one of them. I mean, fan is derived from the word fanatic, and many of them are pretty. You see that when a referee makes a call they don't like. But I had no relationship with him, obviously. And yet Gretzky's younger son and daughter at the time, they had access to him, and they had relationship with him. They could ask him for things. Maybe not bread, eggs, and fish. Maybe pancakes, Eggos, and fish and chips or something like that. And he would provide for them. Right? And I might have known a lot more than his children about their dad at some level. Like I read his autobiography, I knew his stats, I knew his height, his weight, the various brands that he liked, right? And what he endorsed. I knew all those things about him, but I didn't know him. I didn't know him at all. He was not my parent. I was nothing to him. His children knew him. They had a relationship with him. They could ask him for things, and he had the power to give it to them. Now, even with them, I highly doubt that he gave them everything they asked for. Because, of course, sometimes parents say no. Sometimes they cannot grant what a child asks, even if they wanted to and deeply desired to. They don't have the means. But often parents say no because they don't believe it'll be a good thing for their children. But there's also times when sometimes parents don't even know about earthly needs, and children need to ask and bring it to their attention. My mattress has springs sticking out of it. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, why didn't you tell me? We need to get a new one. And sometimes gifts are surprises, genuine surprises, but often gifts come as a result of asking, of making needs and requests known, and then those gifts being granted. Many Christians kind of believe that idea that everything's going to happen exactly as it is, regardless of whether we pray or not. And different theologies have grappled and struggled with that, what some have called the problem of prayer. But as Willard points out, this makes prayer psychologically impossible. If you believe everything's going to happen, whether you pray or not, whether you ask or not, That's somewhat impossible. If you actually believed as a child that your parents would never do anything differently because you asked, you would never ask. And that's not here the biblical notion or idea of prayer here. God is not the unmoved mover of Greek philosophy. He's personal, relational. He's a father who's concerned about his children. And prayer is the means that he's established for this relationship. Ask, and you shall receive. Of course, we can go on and on about all our questions and speculations and objections, and it raises a lot. There's a lot of different rabbit holes we can go down there. C.S. Lewis grappled with many of these questions in a very short essay called The Efficacy of Prayer. But he cites this one saying of a respected Christian leader who once said, "All I know is that when I pray, coincidences happen. When I don't pray, coincidences don't." Right? When I pray, they happen. Right? Earlier in the sermon, Jesus said, "Your Father knows what you need before you ask. So why ask?" And yet, he invites them, ask. Right? So what do we ask? Some know that old song, "Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz?" Right? "My friends all drive Porsches, I must make amends." Janis Joplin doing it a bit sarcastically, satirically, but many have that idea. Well, I want a Benz, my Porsche. This is what I ask. Okay, just ask. It's a blank check. God is a slot machine. But James, in the New Testament letter, most closely to the Sermon on the Mount, I think we have this passage as well in James chapter 4, verse 3. James says something very interesting. If we have it up there, we'll have it in James 4, verse 3. But James says, "You do not have because you do not ask." You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. And that's an interesting expression, right? And yet, Tom Wright kind of points out something very, very, very well for, I think, most of us, the crux of the matter. He says, for most of us, the problem is not that we're too eager to ask for the wrong things. The problem is that we're not nearly eager enough to ask for the right things, the things we need day by day. If he's a father, let's treat him as a father, not a bureaucrat or a dictator who wouldn't want to be bothered with our trivial and irrelevant concerns. Treat him as a father. Ask him as a father. The words are disarmingly simple. They're not hard to understand, and yet we struggle to believe that our prayers actually matter. We struggle with this picture of God's actual interest in us. And Jesus' words kind of prod us on this. And then all of a sudden, he just shifts to the golden rule. So, and we're left wondering, and how he can call, now he all of a sudden talks to how treating the relationship with God and then the relationship with others, summing up in many ways the law and the prophets, the Sermon on the Mount, that in everything do to others what you'd have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. One sentence of how we're to relate to others and with other people. And many of you have heard this. Many people that don't know much about the Bible or Jesus know the golden rule. It's justly famous. He's not the first to have a similar type rule. Many sages and teachers before and after him have said something similar. 500 years before Christ, one of China's greatest teachers and moral thinkers, known in English as Confucius, was asked a question by one of his disciples, who asked him, "Is there a single word which could be adapted as a lifelong rule of conduct?" Is there a single word, one word, that can be adapted as a lifelong rule of conduct? And Confucius replied and says, "Is not sympathy the word? Do not do to others what you would not like yourself." Now, some have heard it in different translations, a word shu that many argue, is it reciprocity, is it sympathy, is it empathy? But later, it's spelled out, and do not do to others what you would not want them to do to you. Some have called this the silver rule, and some have applied this to Hillel as well. There was a great rabbi a few years before Jesus' day, in Jesus' time, one of the great Jewish rabbis named Hillel, who had something very similar. When a convert came up to him and wanted to ask him, "Can you tell me the whole Torah, the whole law, while standing on one leg?" While I stand on one leg. Some of you guys, can you preach the whole sermon while you stand on one leg? And maybe our sermons will be shorter. But here he says this: "What is hateful to you, Do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, the whole law. The rest is commentary. Now, some people have said these are the same. Confucius, Hillel, and we can find it in other religions and philosophies, the Epicureans, the Stoics, all these, there's a lot of these sayings. And there's a lot of wisdom there in those sayings. And many have said Jesus is saying the same thing. But we note the difference. He puts it in a positive form. It's one thing not to do something hurtful and hateful and distasteful to another person. It's one thing not to do. It's another thing entirely to do something positive and gracious. The negative form kind of alone suggests if you don't enjoy being yelled at and cursed at, don't do it to others. If you don't like it when a driver cuts you off, don't cut that driver off. I mentioned The Undertaker, the radio host who liked to bury people. Right? In his stories, was known for his cutting and biting remarks, his quick, sharp wit that he kind of wielded as a sword against people. For that host, the negative form might be a bit easier, just involve him biting his tongue, keep some of his cutting remarks to himself, not doing various things. The negative form is not as high a standard as Jesus' form. It's not just saying if you don't like people snapping and yelling at you, don't do it to others. He's saying something positive. Do unto others. Do good unto others. Google, early in its company's kind of lifespan, had this corporate model, don't be evil. Don't be evil. And then they changed it. Do the right thing. There's a world of difference between those two. Right? Don't be evil and trying to say, do the right thing. About what is the right thing, what is the good thing. Right? And the positive form of the golden rule promotes a different type of behavior. If you like being appreciated, show appreciation to others. If you like when someone kindly lets your car into traffic, do the same to others. It calls upon us to use some moral imagination. And it takes us beyond just, what is just, to the region of generosity, grace, do unto others. This is the difference of the kingdom of ethics. Later in Matthew, when a lawyer asked Jesus that famous question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment?" There's so many. Jesus replies this in Matthew 22, verse 37. We might have that on the screen. And most of you have heard these over and over. But Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." And notice verse 40. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. It hinges and hangs on these and hangs from them. In the golden rule, Jesus says, this is the law and prophets. This sums it up. Paul will say something very similar in Galatians 5. He says, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. Right? There's no discrepancy here. James calls this the royal law. That's interesting, the royal law. If you really keep the royal law, he says, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. You're doing what's good, what is right. And Jesus' golden rule captures that in everything. Notice that word, in everything do to others what you wish them to do for you. Right? It's everything. It's totalizing. It's not burdensome, this burdensome thing. It's this remarkably flexible ethical principle and teaching of Jesus. Right? It's so flexible that it's the final word in the driving manual in one American state. Treat other drivers as you would want to be treated. That answers a lot of rules of the road. Right? Brian has told us a lot of driving stories over the years, but it's where the rubber literally hits the road. And the golden rule applies there. This flexible principle that allows us to be self-reflective and to use our imagination to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to ask, how would I like to be treated in that situation? And J.C. Ryle, over 100 years ago, he said, this settles 100 difficult points, which in a world like this are continually arising. Think of all the new questions with AI and the internet and chat forums and all constantly new questions of how we act and conduct ourselves. Constantly arriving. It prevents the necessity of laying down endless little rules for our conduct in specific cases. It sweeps the whole debatable ground with one mighty principle. It's this practical principle that relates to our life in our home, in the church, in the workplace, in the car, in the classroom, in the grocery store, the playground, and everything. It's this vision that summarizes a way of being in the world that no amount of rules or regulations could ever encompass or hope to promote. It asks us to say, what would I want? How would I want others to be treated? It leads us out of ourselves into a more reasoned empathy for others. McKnight humorously says, instead of saying WWJD, what would Jesus do? Maybe we need a brace that says WWIW. What would I want? What would I want? What would I want here? Well, if I were you, I would probably want this sermon to come to an end. So we're just going to close in a word of prayer before Peter comes up and leads us in our closing song. But let's just pray. Our Father, we thank you once again for the words of Jesus, for these remarkable promises that are so surprising and open, that when we ask, you hear us. When we seek, you let yourself be found. When we knock, you open. These words are direct and straightforward, and yet we struggle with them. Many of us will struggle with them. And help us to come to a greater trust in you as a good and generous and caring Father, far more faithful than we can comprehend. Forgive us, Lord, for the times we've doubted your love or given up so quickly in prayer. We ask, as your prayer taught us, deliver us from these temptations that snare us and trip us up. Help us to come to you with childlike trust and a bold faith and open hearts, and bring our needs to you as a good Father. And also teach us not to let our prayers stop with our own needs. Help us to become the kind of people who reflect your goodness to others. Let the mercy that we've received shape the mercy we show. Let the kindness we've found in you overflow to our neighbors. Help us to live these words, to do for others what we'd have them do for us. Ultimately, we're reminded once again of that example of Jesus that we've sung about. But we read of his remarkable trust in you, even in the midst of this very human struggle and agony to the point of death, just praying and asking 3 times, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. He allowed himself to be taken and crucified and gave his life for us, so we can have life in a relationship with you as our Father. And for this, we are truly thankful. And we just pray that your Spirit would use these words to speak and connect with the people here that have come under the sound of the Lord's sermon again in the ways that you see fit. And we just ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.